Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. My name is Camille, I'm your host, and as always, so happy that you're here. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you're having a good week, a productive week. I hope that you are being gentle with yourself this week and that you are able to show love to yourself and everyone else. Today, we are talking about a topic that affects all of our relationships, and that is communication. There is so much to be said about communication. And I think that it's important that we talk about a lot of these elements, because when I work with people about their relationships, whether that be in individuals or in couples, because I also work with couples, a lot of times we'll say that we have a problem with communication, but what it comes down to often is that we have a problem with understanding. And so when we say communication, we aren't just talking about the words that we say, but we're talking about the mindset that we have, the motivation for the words that we say, the intention in our communication, and the perspective that we bring to whatever the conversation is. So it's way more than just what we're saying. It's also how we're saying it, and it's how we are receiving information. So we're going to talk about communication from a few different standpoints, and we're also going to look at biblical examples of being considerate in our communication to other people, because honestly, that's what it comes down to a lot of the time. A lot of the time, it comes down to the fact that we are selfish in our communication and we are more concerned with ourselves than the other person. And you may think, well, of course, because I'm the one who has something to say. But what we find is that when we only consider ourselves and not the other person in communication, especially when we're communicating about sensitive or challenging topics, that it actually makes it harder to understand and to be understood. So in order to be understood and to get your point across, it actually takes a level of self-sacrifice while we're communicating, because we have to prioritize the other person's needs so that they can hear us, so that they can be in a space where we can be heard. So that's where we're going to start today. One of the primary issues that I see a lot with communication and the ways that we communicate is that we are more focused on ourselves. We're focused on what we have to say. We're focused on how we feel. We're focused on what we're hoping to get from this conversation. We're focused on whether or not we're right and not wanting to be wrong. All of that is about us, which says that there's a lot that we're actually missing when we're talking to other people. I remember a while back, someone was talking about that book, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Never read the whole book, but they were going through all the different habits. And the one that stuck with me was that it is better to seek to understand than to be understood. And that has always stuck with me, because I find it to be very effective when we are trying to communicate sensitive topics. Usually when we go into these conversations, we are really just wanting to get our point across, and we want the other person to hear us. We want them to understand. But if both people are just focused on getting their point across, if both people are focused on being heard, then no one's actually hearing the other. And so when you have a posture of trying to understand and wanting to understand the other person, it changes how you navigate the conversation. So you ask more questions, you get more clarity, you get really specific in making sure that you know what the other person is trying to communicate, and then your response can be more effective because it can be more accurate. I've had people say, well, Camille, if I'm trying to understand the other person, who's trying to understand me? Well, usually when you make people feel understood, then in turn, they're in a position where they're more open to understanding you. So if both people are trying to understand one another, then both people walk away feeling way more understood. But that's like counterintuitive for a lot of us. We enter into some of these conversations, and honestly, I think some of it is because of past experiences that we've had. A lot of us have had instances where we have felt unheard, unseen, misunderstood, minimized when we're talking to other people. And so now we try to get ahead of it and we make sure that I'm going to get my point across no matter what. And so there is this kind of fear that if I hold space for someone else, then I'm not holding space for myself and no one else is going to hold space for me. Therefore, there is no space for me. I can understand that. I have absolutely felt that way in the past. But the fact of the matter is, all communication involves multiple parties. And we also have to understand that people are bringing their own perspectives to what it is that we're communicating about. Rarely is there a right or wrong necessarily. And so in order to be effective communicators, we also have to be effective listeners, right? We've all heard about active listening and empathetic listening. That's a part of it too. So if we're going in with this kind of scarcity mindset, like there's only space for one of us to be heard and it's going to be me, then you're like asking for conflict and then no one's going to end up being heard. So, and we don't want that either. Okay, so I'm sure most of us have heard about the different love languages, and it's important that you understand how your partner or your loved one gives and receives love so that you can love them in ways that you know that is going to be meaningful to them. And when we talk about communication, it's important that you understand the other party's communication style, how they best communicate. And you need to know your communication style, how we speak and how we listen. Now, there are a lot of different kind of schools and thoughts and upwards of like 10 or 12 different styles of communication. But generally, there are four main categories of communication. And we want to know how the other person communicates so that we are interpreting what they're saying, what they're doing, their body language, their tonality, so we can interpret all of that with the understanding of the way that they generally communicate. It's important that we know that so that we don't take things as personal. Here's the thing. There are so many misunderstandings because when we are communicating about important things, we get very emotional and we get defensive. And I always say, and I will continue to say, the moment someone becomes defensive, the conversation is over. So part of the benefit of understanding your own communication style and someone else's communication style is so that we are less defensive or we don't get as easily offended by other people. If you know that someone that you're speaking with is more of a passive communicator, then maybe you know that when they get quiet, that they are processing something. Or that if they don't have like a fully formulated thought, they're not going to say anything, and that they're not ignoring you, but they're still trying to gather their own thoughts. If you don't know that, then you might think that they're stonewalling or that they're shutting you out, and then it's going to lead to more conflict. So understanding your communication style and the other person's communication style can be really helpful in avoiding conflict. Now, we know that we cannot always avoid conflict, but when conflict comes in the middle of trying to talk about something sensitive or something important, then we end up focusing on the conflict and not on the important thing anymore. And then the thing in general gets lost. And that's really the purpose of why we want to put effort into making sure we communicate well so that our messaging does not get lost. The Bible talks about the power of life and death being in the tongue. And there are so many examples of how we ought to be slow to speak, and we need to be very thoughtful in the way that we speak, because it can have such an impact. And the word that we say, you can't really take back the words that you say. Once you've said something, it's out there, right? I often say you can't unhear it. Once you heard something, you really can't unhear it. It's already been said. And our words are very powerful. We all know how deep words can cut. We've all been cut by somebody else's words. Or maybe you're the one who cuts people with your words. I may not have been guilty of that, but I'm growing from it. The Lord is working on me. But we all know how impactful our words can be, for good and for bad. But if we are not mindful of how we're speaking, and if we're not mindful of our mindset and our emotionality when we are speaking, then our message can get lost, and we could end up causing more damage. And if we cause more damage, then you are chasing people away instead of inviting people close to you. And as Christians, we know that we are trying to make disciples and that we're wanting to invite people not only to us, but to the God in us. And if we are not able to find a way to speak to people in ways that are going to make them feel loved, even when we're communicating about difficult things, then we're not going to be able to fulfill that mission. So on a spiritual level, it's important that we learn how to communicate well with other people so that we can be good disciples and so that we can make disciples. Mentally and emotionally, it's important that we communicate well because it's going to affect our relationships. And our relationships are such a big part of our wellness. They're such a big part of our wellness. We're simply not meant to do life alone. Whether it's romantic, family relationships, ooh, that's a big one. That is a big one. Let me say, I always say that one of my secret powers is that I feel like I've learned how to say difficult and challenging things in ways that are palpable and easily digested or easier to digest. And I really attribute that to learning how to say things in a family, in the context of my family. I didn't get in trouble for much. I didn't get in trouble for much growing up, but I did get in trouble for my mouth. I did, because I'm going to say the things, okay? And I'm going to say them kind of directly. And that's not always the best way to be heard, especially as a child. And so I have learned how to say things in less offensive ways, not out of people pleasing. Well, not exclusively out of people pleasing, but I learned that in order to be heard, I have to not offend, because when you offend, then the other person feels like they need to defend. And now, instead of hearing, they're combating what you're saying, and they're no longer hearing what you're saying. So you might say that it came from a selfish place of like, oh no, I need to be heard. I need you to hear what I'm saying. So how can I say this in a way that's going to keep you in a mindset where you are still open and receptive? That's where that came from. I really attribute a lot of growing my communication skills from my family. We also had a lot of different personality styles in my family, and so you kind of have to learn how to navigate a lot of that. Anyway, my point being, whatever kind of relationship we're talking about, you have to communicate in those relationships. And when there's tension in our relationships, that can affect our mental and emotional wellness in a lot of ways. So this is one of the things where I always believe that it is worth the investment in learning to communicate well with the people that you love. So let's break down these general categories of communication styles. So the first communication style is passive. Someone who is a passive communicator is one that probably doesn't say much, or I guess a more accurate way of saying it is that they don't always say what's on their mind. Passive communication is when we hope and expect that other people will just read between the lines and that we shouldn't have to say something and they should just know. Sometimes that comes from a fear of judgment. And so instead of saying the thing, we just kind of hope that the other person will know it. But none of us are mind readers. So this is not the most effective communication style. This is one, though, that is common in those of us who have struggled with people pleasing. Oftentimes just deferring to the other person and letting the other person be right, or going with their decision if it's a matter of trying to come to a conclusion together, kind of yielding to the other person a lot, and really trying to avoid conflict. Now, sometimes this communication style comes from having a lot of relationships that are unsafe, maybe even physically unsafe. And so when there are circumstances where you have to avoid conflict for your own personal safety, then this is likely the communication style that you're going to yield to, which we completely understand when it's a matter of your personal safety. If me saying this thing is potentially going to get me hurt, then why would I say the thing? Hello? But generally, this is the kind of communication style where there's some sort of hesitation or avoidance of saying the things that are on your mind because of maybe some sort of fear of repercussion or of judgment. And so this can be a challenging one and definitely not the most effective. The next communication style is aggressive, which is pretty much the opposite of that. An aggressive communicator has no problem expressing themselves, and they don't have any problem expressing themselves even if it's at someone else's expense. Meaning I'm going to say exactly what's on my mind, exactly how it is on my mind, regardless of who's around or how it might make you feel. We really don't have very much of a filter if you're an aggressive communicator. It's coming out exactly how it is. This type of communicator, when they're confronted with something, they might get a little bit hostile, maybe don't take very well to criticism. And that ends up alienating other people because you're hurting other people when you're doing that, and alienates them. And so while your needs might get met in the moment because people are just afraid of making you upset, so they're going to, kind of yield to what you want, your needs might be getting met, but you're alienating other people when we use this form of communication. No one else is being heard or understood. And so people are probably going to come to you less and less with things if this is how you communicate. The next communication style is passive aggressive. All of us know what this is. All of us have had at least one family member who would fall into this category of communication. This is the type of communicator where on the surface they're seeming passive. Everything seems fine and mellow on the surface. But underneath the surface, that's not really the case. So there's a lot of subtle things happening with this type of communication. Subtly acting out some maybe underlying anger or resentment, a lot of sarcasm in this kind of communication, laughing it off as a joke when really you were actually very serious in that thing that you were said. Sometimes it can also be kind of manipulative in trying to control other people. So you'll say "Oh no, I'm not upset. I just think it's kind of funny that someone who claims to love other people would act this way. That's just not my understanding of what it means to love someone, but I'm not upset by it. I just didn't know that you were that kind of person." Something like that. Passive aggressive. What are you actually trying to say? Do we have a problem here? Is something, what are we actually getting at? That's that passive aggressive communication. And while in the moment, sometimes it might seem like we're doing that so that we're not just being very direct and blunt and trying not to hurt other people, that actually ends up hurting people more because of the manipulative element and the controlling element that makes it so that people don't know if they can trust you, if this is the way that you communicate. And then lastly, we have assertive communication. This is the ideal communication style. This is the goal, the healthiest and most effective way of communicating. An assertive communicator is able to be direct and honest in communicating their needs and their feelings while being respectful of the other person's needs and feelings as well. There is room for both. This is one of those things where it's not either or. It's not either my needs or yours, my feelings or yours. There really is room for both. We don't necessarily have to tiptoe around other people's feelings, and we don't have to suppress our own. I can be honest and direct without being hostile and aggressive and violent in my language. And I can be respectful of your needs while still expressing my own. That's the goal. Because a lot of communication falls into a passive aggressive or an aggressive style, the assertive communicator can be confused as aggressive sometimes. But the difference is that when we're being assertive, we're still being considerate and respectful of other people. Now, in my refinement, I try and hope that I lean more towards an assertive communicator, but I know that in my youth, I probably was much more aggressive in my communication. That is some feedback that I've gotten, that I have been aggressive in my communication. So that's something that I have actively tried to work on, because it's never my intention to hurt other people with my words, but I have to receive the fact that other people have been hurt by my words. And that's a big part of communication, right? So we have to understand the difference between intent and impact, intent versus impact. A lot of times when someone says, "Oh, you hurt my feelings when you say this," our response will be, "Oh, well, I didn't mean it, so you shouldn't take it that way." Well, just because you didn't mean to hurt their feelings doesn't mean that their feelings were not hurt. And when we say things like, "Well, I didn't mean it," that is minimizing the fact that someone's feelings were hurt. When it comes down to intent versus impact, the impact is what's more important. The impact, how it lands with the other person, is what's going to determine whether or not they're going to be able to listen to you with an open mind and an open heart. If you have insulted them in what you're saying, then why would they want to be open to anything else that you're saying at that point? And so even if it was not your intention to hurt them, we have to sometimes own up to the fact that my words were hurtful. Maybe I was a little bit reckless and thoughtless in how I said that. And that not only hurt the other person, but it made it so that they don't feel safe communicating things with me anymore, or they don't feel safe communicating about this thing with me anymore. So with these communication styles, think about which one you may align more with. Honestly, do some honest reflection. Think about which communication style you probably align more with, but also think about how you respond to different communication styles. The thing is that Communication is easy until it's not. Like, it's easy to talk about lighthearted things. It's easy to talk about like low impact things. But when we have to communicate about things that really matter, things that are important, sensitive subjects, challenging or hard topics, that's when it gets hard, because that's when it gets emotional. And when we have emotionally charged discussions, then the likelihood of someone getting triggered is higher. And when we're triggered, then we go into our fight or flight. When you go into fight or flight while you're in the middle of communicating with someone, that looks like either becoming aggressive or withdrawing and becoming very, very passive in your communication. And neither of those are very effective, especially when we're talking about something that really, really matters. So we want to think about how you respond to different communication styles. Think of a time that you received maybe some hard news or feedback where someone had to share something with you that was not easy for you to hear. Even better if you have two examples of this, like a time when it went well and a time when it didn't go well. But even if you have one example, pull up that example. In that example, think about whether or not you were able to receive that information or that news. If you were able to receive it, why were you able to receive it? What helped you be open and receptive in that moment? And when I say you were able to receive it, were you able to listen and internalize what was being said without maybe becoming overly emotional or defensive? That's what I mean by were you able to receive it? If you were able to receive it, especially if you were able to receive it in the spirit that it was communicated, what helped? Like, how did the other person actually relay that information to you? How did they communicate it to you? Was it the way that they spoke? Was it the words that they used? Was it the setting that you all were in? What was it that made you that made it easier for you to receive what they were communicating to you? Now, if it did not go well, think about why it didn't go well. Think about whether or not you were in a bad mood when we started this conversation. Think about how they spoke and the words that they used. And maybe the setting as well, right? So think about some of the same things, but think about the contributing factors, because what we're actually asking is what affected your mental and emotional state while they were communicating this information to you. That's always going to determine how we interpret information, how we interpret what's being said. It's all about where I am mentally and emotionally while we're having this conversation. So essentially, what helps you understand? In addition to the different communication styles, there are also like high context or low context communicators. A high context communicator is someone who gives you a ton of backstory before they get to the actual point. My dad is a high context communicator. I love him to death. He's a talker. We're talkers. Okay, let me put myself in that category as well. But high context communicators, they want to give all of the backstory, all of the context. They start out wide and then they get narrow. Versus a low context communicator, which is they're going to start with the point. They're going to start with the important thing, and they're going to maybe add some context as needed. So are you someone who needs a lot of background information? You need a lot of context, or does some of that context get in the way for you and you're like, please just get to the point? So high context or low context. Also, how do you communicate? Are you a high or low context communicator? So all the questions that we're asking about how you listen, we're also asking those same questions about how you speak and how you communicate. What helps you understand and what helps them understand? Because whether we like it or not, we need the other person to be in a position where they can remain open and receptive to what we're saying. We all want to be understood. One of the worst feelings in the world is feeling misunderstood. Nobody wants to feel misunderstood. And so we have to be proactive in making sure that the other party is in a space where they can remain open, and that can increase the chances that they're going to understand us and that they're going to hear our heart and where we're coming from. But if they become triggered in the middle of the conversation, then now they're in fight or flight. Now they're defensive. Now they're trying to protect themselves and they're no longer hearing what you have to say. So good communication is considerate communication, compassionate communication. It cannot just be about you. It really does have to be about the other person as well. An example of this in the Bible that I really like comes from the book of Romans. I started studying Romans recently, and I started at chapter 1, and the first 15 verses of chapter 1 is Paul just kind of establishing who he is and his intention in writing to the Romans. Now, earlier when I was talking about intent versus impact, this is a great example of that, because before he got into the meat of what it was that he was trying to say to them, he made his intention very, very clear. Sometimes it is helpful and necessary to communicate your intention before you say the thing, especially if you know that there's not really a way to soften the blow. If I know this is some really like hard hitting and intense stuff that needs to be said, and I haven't found a softer way to say it, let me make my intention clear before I get into it. Right? Sometimes that might sound like, I really want to talk about something. It's been heavy on my heart lately, and I want us to be able to communicate about it. Or this is an area of that I'm really trying to grow in, and I'm letting you know about this so that maybe you can help me grow, or whatever it is, right? Communicating your intention beforehand, it kind of helps the other person know what mindset to be in, but also if what you say does end up being a bit harsh, you've already said to them, I'm not wanting to be harsh. I hope that this is not coming across very harsh, but maybe I don't have a better way of saying this. And so sometimes that can be kind of helpful. So in Romans chapter 1, Paul is writing to the Romans, and like we said a second ago, the first several set of verses is really Paul talking about where he's coming from physically, but also where he's coming from spiritually. He's saying, Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. Essentially, he's saying, I have committed my life to this purpose. I've committed my life to the purpose of the gospel. So anything that I'm saying after this is coming from that foundation of setting my life, of committing my life to the purpose of the gospel. That's setting an intention, right? He's letting them know everything that I do is for the purpose of the gospel and of moving it forward. Later on, around verse 8, 9, and 10, he's saying how much he loves them and how he's been praying for them and he's wanted to come see them. So what he's established first before he really gets into the meat of the letter is everything that I do is for the purpose of the gospel. I love you all. I've been wanting to see you, and I have been praying for you. Because if everything that you're doing is for the purpose of the gospel, then everything that you're doing ought to come from a place of love, because the gospel is all about love. So Paul is saying this, and he's setting this up before he even gets to the actual message. So if someone is saying, "Hey, I'm coming from a place of love. I'm coming from a place of wanting to move the mission of the gospel forward, and this is why I am coming to you with these things," then I'm like, oh, okay, bet I'm open. I'm all ears then, if that's where you're coming from, because I can believe in that mission. I know that you love me before you even say this thing. So whatever it is that you're saying it from a place of love. So that immediately is going to put me in a different mindset than if you were just to come in and condemning me for what I am or am not doing. Because later in the book of Romans, and even in this chapter, there's some heat. There's some heat that Paul is coming with that he needs to share with the Romans. So it was important, because first I was reading through, because I've read Romans 1 before, and I kind of skimmed through like the introductory part of it. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. He just introduced himself because that's just how they spoke back in the day. That's just how they wrote. But I started thinking about it more, and I was like, everything that's included in the Bible is included on purpose. There's meaning in every single part of it, in every single verse. So what is the significance of making sure that we have this introduction that Paul gives before he even gets to the actual meat of the letter? And so I started looking at it, and I said, okay, wait a minute. He's really establishing himself as someone who essentially has authority to speak on these things, but also who's coming from a place of love because he has committed his life to the gospel. I love you because I love Christ. I'm sharing these things with you because I love you, because I love Christ. It's important that was established before he delivered some important and maybe challenging things to the Romans. I am a fan of prepping for challenging conversations, okay? I'm a fan of taking notes. I'm a fan of having some bullet points jotted down for important conversations, because when things get emotional, then logic kind of goes out the window. So in your mind, when you were in the shower and you were driving in the car, going through all this in your mind, you probably had some really good points and were very succinct and precise in what you were saying, and very, very clear in what you were saying. But then in the moment, when your emotions get the best of you, all that goes out the window sometimes. So preparing for conversations is important, whether that's like what you're going to say, or if that's in how you start the conversation and communicating your intention in the conversation. Now, as Christians, we have a responsibility to one another, right? To hold one another accountable and to help one another grow. That's easier said than done. And holding each other accountable can be really hard, because sometimes that looks like telling someone, sis, you were wrong in what you were doing. Essentially what you're saying is, you're getting a little bit off the mark here. And I love you enough to show you this because I want to help you get back on the mark. But especially in today's society, you really can't just say whatever. Because if we're honest, you don't want someone to just come up and say whatever to you. We all can be very sensitive, especially depending on the topic. There are some things that you could say to me like flippantly, and it really won't bother me, and it's going to roll off my shoulder. But there are some things that if you're going to talk to me about this, I need you to have a certain level of sensitivity about it, because I have a level of sensitivity about it. So it's not just that, oh, y'all are too sensitive nowadays and nobody can hear anything and yada, yada, yada. Listen, we have to look in the mirror too and know that there are some things that are soft spots for us too, right? We all have buttons that can be pushed, and we all are capable of pushing one another's buttons. We don't want to do that because we want to communicate with love, just like Paul did. When he was talking to the Romans and telling them about all the things that they were doing that were unrighteous, and really warning them about the consequences of people who have been unrighteous in the past, and really giving them this like a warning and imploring them to change their ways and to make sure that their heart is for God and that they're walking in obedience. Do you think that those were things that they were like happy to hear? Immediately after his introduction, he goes into talking about the wrath of God and talking about the consequences of unbelief. So he had to, first of all, set the stage. Say, listen, I love you and I love God, and this is why I'm telling you this is why I'm telling you these things. Y'all need to get right. Essentially, that's what it was. And the message that he had for them was so important that he couldn't afford for it to get lost. And sometimes, if we do not communicate our intention, and if we are not sensitive in the ways that we're communicating things, our message can get lost. Our message will get lost, which is why we have to be considerate in our communication. Essentially, we have to still be loving. Even when I'm communicating something difficult, when I'm telling you how you hurt my feelings, or I didn't like this, or that this was wrong, I still have to be loving in that. Think about when it's the hardest to be loving to other people. It's when we're operating out of our flesh. It's when they're being rude, when they're being petty, when they're being annoying. That's when it's hard to still be loving, when we're operating out of our flesh, and when maybe we're getting triggered by certain things, or they're making us upset, they're making us angry, right? When we get more emotional, it's difficult for us to be loving to other people in those moments. When we're operating in our flesh, we are impulsive and we are reactive. There's a difference between an emotional reaction and a thoughtful response. We want to respond instead of react, because reactions are impulsive in the moment, just going based off of how I feel. That's when we start hitting below the belt. That's when we start attacking people in the middle of a conversation, when we're being impulsive and when we are being reactive. And so really what we need to understand is that in order to be effective communicators, we need the fruits of the Spirit. We need the fruits of the Spirit so we can be loving, so we can be patient, so we can be kind, so we can be gentle, so we can be long-suffering in our communication with people that we love. And we're supposed to love everybody. So really, we need the fruits of the Spirit to be effective communicators with everyone, regardless of the circumstance or the setting. But I don't think we think about it in that context. But in order to communicate well, we need to do it with the fruits of the Spirit. I need to be able to maintain a posture that is loving, kind, gentle, patient, long-suffering, because there are some things that we are going to have to keep coming back to talk about, right? Some conversations that are really challenging to have can't just be done in one sitting. So if we're going to have to keep coming back to this thing, I'm going to need to be patient with you, and I might need you to give me a little bit of grace and be patient with me as well. And we have to be loving towards one another so we can be considerate enough of the other person to be careful enough with our words to make sure that they don't get offended. Now, sometimes we can only do so much, and some things are just hard to hear. Some things are just hard to hear. What I'm not saying is that we should be more worried with how we're perceived and that there are some things that we just shouldn't say if it's not going to be taken well. That's not what I'm saying. I do believe that what we owe people is honesty and compassion when we're communicating with them. So even if I'm communicating the hardest thing, how can I do that with honesty and with compassion? How can I do that in a considerate way? If I know that what I have to say to you is going to be a hurtful thing, if what I'm saying essentially is that I don't want to be friends anymore, right? That might be a hurtful thing regardless. You can find the nicest way to say it. The fact of me not wanting to be in your life anymore is going to be that's a hurtful thing. I cannot take away the sting of that. If someone said that to me, the sting can't be taken away, right? But because it's already a hard thing, we can do our best to not make it harder, to not make it sting more. Instead of saying, you've been horrible to me and I just don't ever want to see you again. All right, that's a little bit harsh. Or I don't know why anybody would ever want to be your friend. I don't know why I wanted to be your friend for all these years. I should never have done that. That is unnecessarily harsh and not loving at all. But if you were to say, I'm grateful for the time that we had together, and I think we've come to a place now where it's probably best that we go our separate ways, that's a more loving and compassionate way of saying the thing. It's probably still going to hurt because that's just a hurtful thing. That's just a hurtful thing. And there are some things that we have to communicate and that we have to say, and they are going to be hard. They're going to be difficult. But the consideration and the compassion comes in saying, I know that this is already a tough thing, so let me try to see if I can do it in a way that's not going to cause unnecessary harm, unnecessary hurt. Because that's the thing. We should not be trying to hurt people with our words on purpose. For a lot of us, if we wanted to, I'm sure that we could, but that's not godly either. And so we shouldn't be trying to hurt people with our words. The message sometimes is just, it's going to be a hard one. And we can't do anything about that. Because what also happens on the other side of things, and this is where the passive communication can come into play, is that we will simply avoid certain conversations. We'll avoid saying certain things because of how we think it's going to be perceived or because it's going to hurt the other person. So we just don't say it at all. You still have to say the thing. You have to find a way to say the thing. So you want to ask yourself, how can I say this thing in the most loving way possible? How many fruits of the Spirit can I employ when I'm communicating this thing? How can I look most like Christ as I am communicating this difficult message? That's how we can be considerate in our communication, and we ought to. So do I need to communicate my intention beforehand? How can I employ the fruits of the Spirit as I'm saying this so that I can still show love to this person, so I can still show patience, so I can still show long suffering, so that the message is not lost in it? How can I look more like Christ so that my message is not lost? Okay, so that's going to bring us to our scripture for the day. And today we are looking at Ephesians 4 and verse 29, which says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear." Long story short, if you ain't got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing at all. Or if you can't find a nice way to say it, don't say it at all. Or if it don't need to be said, don't say it at all. So that actually takes a certain level of wisdom and discernment. We have to sometimes ask ourselves, does this thing actually need to be said? There are some things that we want to say, but does it need to be said? Is this going to edify and help someone else if I say it? Can I say this with grace? Is this thing going to offer grace to whoever I'm saying it to? So I think in the context of a relationship or a friendship, let's say if someone did something to hurt you, right? And now we're trying to say, well, is this something that needs to be said? Because this verse here says that it should be for the edification of other people. But if you're in a relationship with someone and you're both like actively trying to be in a healthy and secure place, then something might need to be communicated so that the other person can know how to love you well. Right? So I might need to share with you, hey, actually, the other day, I know that you thought that you were making a joke, but that actually made me feel like this. Someone who loves me might want to know that so that they can, in the future, not make that joke because they love me and they don't want me to feel that way, right? Or maybe if we were out somewhere and I saw how you were treating someone else, and I thought that it was, I don't know, really rude or inappropriate, then I might say, remember we were at the restaurant the other day and you were kind of snappy with the waitress, and I kind of want to talk to you about that because I know that you're really trying to work on being more patient and being more kind to other people. And I think that was a missed opportunity. So that's something that could be edifying to someone else. If someone who's close to me knows that I'm trying to work on my self-discipline and they see me just being lazy and not doing things and continuing to procrastinate, then it might be hard to hear, but I probably would be grateful for someone to say, I know that you've been wanting to work on your self-discipline, but I've kind of been noticing that you've been procrastinating more. Because in doing so, we shouldn't just be saying, hey, you're doing this poorly. But I would hope that someone who really loves me and is like-minded would say, I've noticed you've been procrastinating more. Is there something that is making it difficult for you? Or is there a way that I can help? How can I help you? So it goes beyond just saying the thing. What's the action behind what it is that we're saying? How can I help you in this way? Because I love you and I want to see you grow. Or because I love you and I want to help you stay close to God and not drift further away from Him. But sometimes there are some things that we want to say because we just want to get it off of our chest. And it may not be edifying to anyone at all, but it might just make us feel good about it. Well, that's something that maybe you can put in your journal, but is it something that really needs to be said? How is it going to help anyone? We've all been there where we know that I want to give them a piece of my mind because I want them to know, I want them to hurt how I hurt, right? Is that edifying and uplifting? Is that giving grace? Is that wholesome? Let no unwholesome thing come from your mouth. And I know that sometimes that feels unjust. Sometimes it feels unjust or unfair that might mean that sometimes people get away with not being kind to us. But we still have a call to be kind to other people. Other people are going to have to answer for what they do or don't do. Vengeance is not ours. It belongs to the Lord. And sometimes vengeance is in me getting my lick back through what I'm going to say. Or vengeance might be you're going to hear about yourself and you're going to hear about all the ways that you hurt me and this, and that. I remember when I had a relationship come to an end, and I used to say that I really wanted the opportunity to let that person know how they made me feel. Even though I didn't really have any interest in resuming a relationship, I just wanted them to know how they made me feel. And I probably could put it under the guise of, I want you to know how you made me feel so that way you don't make anyone else feel that way. But really, that just would have been for me. That just would have been for me. And honestly, that opportunity came around and I did share some things, but there are also some things that I did not share because it wouldn't have been helpful, wouldn't have been productive, wouldn't have been edifying. And it probably would have done even more damage, even though the relationship had ended, but there still is more damage that could have been done. And at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about any decision that we're making, is this going to make me look more or less like Christ? Is this going to bring me closer to Him or further away from Him? Even in our communication with other people. The power of life and death is in the tongue. The words that we say can cause a lot of damage. I don't know about you. Me personally, I don't really want to be responsible for that kind of damage in somebody else's life. I'm supposed to be a representative of Jesus Christ. So if I'm supposed to be a representative of Him all the time, if I am constantly trying to be filled with the fruits of the Spirit and with the Holy Spirit, then if there's a part of me that's saying, I want to tell someone this so that I can hurt their feelings, I'm operating out of my flesh and not out of the Spirit. I'm not being loving. I'm not being compassionate. I'm not being considerate. I understand that takes a certain level of maturity to get to. I do. And that in the moment that might feel like a sacrifice, and maybe sometimes it is. But that is what we're called to do. And in the relationships that we're still in and that they're still active and that we care about, we still have to sometimes be self-sacrificing in that moment. Meaning maybe I need to listen before I speak. And sometimes that feels unjust. But for the sake of the relationship, sometimes we have to do that. And we have to be careful with what it is that we're saying. There's another verse that says that our words need to be seasoned like salt so that they can be digestible. I don't want to eat nothing that's unseasoned, do you? I hope not. So we have to be more active in our communication. We have to be more thoughtful in our communication. We have to be more considerate in the ways that we communicate. We need to look more like Christ in our communication. Okay, so that is going to bring us to our question of the day. Just as a reminder, if you have a question that you want answered on the show, you can send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com, or you can put a comment wherever you are listening or watching this. So I have gotten a couple of questions lately about surrender and just asking, what does it actually mean and what does it really look like in a practical sense to surrender to God's will for your life? Someone said, what does surrender actually look like? Like not masking what you're feeling to appear surrendered, but true surrender in the waiting. I can appreciate this question because we all want like practical tips and we want to know like what does it actually look like. I think there are a lot of these concepts that we hear about and we talk about them like theoretically, but we don't actually have examples of what it looks like to carry them out. And surrender is one of those. That's one of those words that we associate a lot with our faith and with Christianity, and we're like, okay, yes, surrender, I surrender all. But what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And so in the context of what we're talking about, especially, I think that in the day to day, it's about denying ourselves to look more like him. So I think generally when I think about what it means to surrender, there are like two things that come to mind, right? Number one is acknowledging and accepting and embracing the fact that we are not in control, which means that we are not the ones calling the shots. What this might look like is being more open to pivoting, like when something is not going the way that we want it to go. I think a lot of us have been in situations where we have tried so hard to make something happen. We have an idea that we want and we try so hard to make it happen. Or we try 3, 4, and 5 different ways to make this thing happen and it's just not happening and we're just hurting ourselves in the process. In that case, surrender might look like saying, you know what? Okay, God, if this is not it, then you show me what is. And being open to other things or other opportunities outside of the thing that you are trying to accomplish. It looks like acknowledging that you may not know what's best for you and asking God for the guidance because you don't know what's best for you. Surrender is acknowledging that he's in charge, he's in control, and you are not. That's a scary place for us to be because we really, really love control. And so what that might look like is going to God with every single decision that you're making, praying about every single decision that you're making before you're making it, asking and waiting for his guidance before you make a decision. For me, that looked like, or that continues to look like, looking for God in everything, listening for God in everything, finding comfort in the fact that he's in everything that I do and he's everywhere that I am. And if I'm always looking for that, and if I know that I am doing my best to like abide in him and to dwell in him, then he's the one who's guiding everything that I'm doing. The other component of surrender is the denying of self. So earlier when we're talking about communication and how we need all the fruits of the spirit, we need to look like Christ in our communication. Denying yourself might be not saying the thing that you really want to say because you know it's not Christ-like. And looking for every opportunity to look like Christ instead of looking like your flesh. So we have to be present enough to acknowledge our impulses as they come up and be able to do an assessment of whether or not this is Christ-like. Surrender means denying yourself, less of me, more of you. That's surrender. If this is not a Christ-like decision, then I am surrendering to your sovereignty in this moment and to my commitment to looking more and more like Christ. That might look like getting up a little earlier on Sundays to make sure you get to church on time because you can get to work on time, but not to church on time. How does that work? Right? That might look like surrender, right? Denying myself to look more like Christ. Maybe letting someone else win the argument, even though you know that there's a part of you that loves the debate and loves to be right. And you probably know that you're right about this thing, but it maybe would cause more conflict in your relationship and it wouldn't be very loving to continue to argue about this thing. So maybe that's what that looks like. So those are the two things that come to mind when I think about the practicality of surrender. I've talked before about, like my kind of my career path and like some of the frustrations that I've had and tried to how I've tried to go back to a 9 to 5, but it just hasn't worked. My mom said to me years ago when I was still an undergrad, she said, and I always say that this is the best advice that I ever received. And it wasn't until later in life that I really realized what she was talking about was surrender. But what she said to me was, as a child of God, you don't have to keep kicking against the brick trying to make something happen. You don't have to keep kicking against the brick. We can just turn a little bit one way or another, and God has already created a pathway for you. And sometimes surrender means accepting the fact that the way that you're trying to go is not the best way for you, and that God has a better way for you. Surrender is not always pretty. It's not this like angelic thing that you just feel so good after. Sometimes it can be really painful because it causes you to have to let go of things that you were holding on to for a long time because you thought it was good for you. You thought it was what you wanted for yourself. But you have to acknowledge that God knows what's best for you better than you do. It's yielding to his sovereignty in all things. That's going to look different for different people. And I recognize that even as I'm talking about it now, it might be a little bit vague, but I think it's for each of us to evaluate, what does surrender look like for me? And I think even it changes on a day to day. What does surrender look like for me today? Today, what does surrender look like for me? Honestly speaking, for me today, right now, it looks like recording this podcast at the time I'm recording it. It's like 11 o'clock in the PM. I'm not, I listen, it's past my bedtime. It's past my bedtime, but I know that I needed to record this episode. And I know that if I didn't do it today, that I wouldn't have much peace about it. I know that I've been procrastinating, and I know that I still have been struggling with my self-discipline, and that's a fruit of the spirit that I'm trying to grow in. And I know that every day I have more and more opportunities to grow in this particular fruit of the spirit. And so for me, surrender meant staying up late in order to be obedient, in order to exercise this fruit of the spirit, in order to do the thing that I know is going to help me look more like Christ. For me, that's what surrender means today. So what does surrender mean for you today? And ask yourself again tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. Surrendering to God and to his will for our life is a decision that we have to make every single day. But if you truly believe that his will is better than yours, then it's something that I'm willing to do every day. One of my mantras is that there's liberation in surrender. And that's because I'm surrendering to the fact that the person who deserves to be in control, the person who actually can take the weight of being in control, he's already in the driver's seat. So I really don't have to worry about as much. All I have to do is be obedient. When I put it in those terms, then it helps me to understand that my role is secondary in all of this. I don't have as much pressure of trying to make all the decisions. The decision is already made. I believe that the decision is already made. I believe that the right decision is already made. I think part of the challenge in our surrender is in our relinquishing control. It's our anxiety that makes it hard for us to surrender. If we don't know step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then we're going to freak out and we're going to have a hard time. We have to surrender to the fact that God knows what he's doing, and we don't surrender to the fact that he has a plan and he already knows the conclusion and that he has already won the victory. So maybe another word for surrender is acceptance. How can you accept who God is, who he is in your life? Accept that he has a will for your life. Accept that he is going to order your steps in accordance with that will if we ask him to. So surrender is relinquishing control and denying yourself every day. Every day. I don't think that we have to pretend that it's easy. I think that's the mask that we wear sometimes, that it's easy to do, but it's not. It's not. Living for God is not easy. It never was, and it was never going to be. And it's because we're always going to have that constant battle between our flesh and our spirit. And so surrender is denying the flesh and allowing the spirit to guide everything that we're doing at all times. My preacher says that being a true disciple and true surrender is about committing your whole self to God for your whole life. That is a decision that we make every single day over and over again. And it shows up in everything that we do, even in our communication. It shows up there. How can I surrender to God in this conversation? How can I surrender and deny myself in this conversation? How can I relinquish control in this conversation? So again, I know that's still a little bit abstract, but that's a journey that everyone has to go on individually with God. But I hope that at least maybe gave you a little bit of direction and guidance, and made it a bit more practical. Because I think a lot of us want to surrender. We want to be able to say that we surrender to God, but just don't really know how. So know that it's going to be uncomfortable a little bit, but this is where your faith has to carry you through. This is where you decide to trust God instead of yourself. That's true surrender, and that leads to true intimacy with Him. All right. That is all that I have for you all. That felt like a mouthful, but I hope that it was helpful. Thank y'all so much for being here and for your continued support and encouragement and engagement with this podcast. I hope that you'll stick around, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts, and if the Spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com, and make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.